I'm Kyle Malnati, your host of the Calibrate Real Estate Podcast. At Calibrate, we exist to help people create generational wealth through real estate. My personal mission is to encourage, empower, and educate you by sharing best practices from business leaders that are proven winners. Broadcasting from the Mile High City, thank you for tuning in to yet another episode of the Calibrate Real Estate Podcast. I am so excited to share that John Warrillow has published his third book, and that's right over my shoulder here. It's right in my hands, The Art of Selling Your Business. John also has written Built to Sell and The Automatic Customer. John's the host of the Built to Sell radio show. John, welcome to our show.
Hey, thanks for having me. Good to be here.
I'm so excited to just have a discussion with you about negotiating, about what it's like to sell businesses. One of the things here in the United States, and it may be that way in Canada where you are as well, is a huge show. And I hope I'm not violating any copyright or whatever, but Shark Tank is a big show that a lot of people love. And I watch that with my own kiddos, and it's just really cool to see people investing in businesses, and whether it's an angel investor or someone comes in to buy someone's business out. And that's something that you've become an expert at. For our real estate audience, for our real estate practitioners, I want to zero into chapter 14 because I found it to be the most interesting, as we're, depending on what market you're in, there's the idea of competitive offers, but also just someone might be in commercial real estate putting together a letter of interest or an LOI, and some things to look for in your experience on how to drive a great deal. And you've titled this chapter in your book, You Set the Price, I'll Set the Terms. So to set the scene for our audience, you've talked to a lot of different business owners that have sold their business, and sometimes it's on the up and up, and then all of a sudden something changes. And, in this particular case, it was the internet bubble bursting, and just all of a sudden, as someone's looking at what was a great offer and all of a sudden it was taken off the table, what they do next. I found it very interesting that you made a point in this chapter. And my question here is price always the most important thing, or should we be considering terms sort of lockstep with the price that someone might offer for any type of negotiation?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, there's an old expression among mergers and acquisitions professionals, which is the name of the chapter. You set the price, I'll set the terms. And it reinforces the idea that you can throw out any outlandish number in evaluation, but it can all be taken away in the terms. Like, I'm reminded a guy I interviewed on my podcast named Ryan Moran, just maybe a month ago. And he built a great business, built it up to $18 million in revenue, sold it, but he sold it to a private equity group. And the way private equity groups work is they generally buy a majority, but not all of your company. In his case, I think they bought about 60% of his business, and he was asked to roll 40% into the deal. And that all sounded great, and it was a great valuation. So Ryan thought, this is amazing, went forward with the deal. And weeks later, the private equity company brought in a new CEO to run Ryan's company. Didn't know what he was doing. Ultimately, the business started to fail. The private equity group couldn't pay off the debt that they had taken on to buy Ryan's company. Long story short, the business failed under new leadership, and that equity went to zero. And Ryan walked away having sold 60% of his business, but getting nothing for the other 40%. And it reminds me of just the importance of the terms, right? Like, not just the valuation, because in Ryan's case, it was a massive valuation, but what are the terms under which I'm going to get my money? And that's, I think, a really important piece. And as you say, it much of it can be taken away through the terms.
Yeah, it's a great reminder to us, all of us in the real estate profession, that don't get trapped by maybe the mirage of pricing. And especially in a multiple offer situation, many of us have dealt with that for our clients that we list a property for, that you're trying to really decipher and help your client decipher which is the best offer to take, because you can only take one. And we all know that once you go under contract or under agreement, or in this non-compete, situation, whatever you want to call it, whatever frame of doing a negotiation you talk about, once the party is over, once the parade is gone, you're now one-on-one. And guess what? Especially in commercial real estate, which is one of the areas that I practice in an area that I love, is watch out for the retrade. And that's something that you talk about a lot, is that once you've got someone that is under an agreement with you, all of a sudden there's going to be maybe a renegotiation and what that needs to look like. And I love how you commented in your book specifically about the book originally, but then also the great movie that a lot of people have seen called The Blind Side about Michael Orr, and how the person that's negotiating on your behalf, and as a real estate agent, we would look at that as we're the advocate for the client. But you also speak about mergers and acquisitions, that there's an important role of an intermediary. So what have you learned just how an intermediary differs from an attorney? I found that to be very interesting in your book.
Yeah, so we typically, when you sell a company, that you have an intermediary being an agent of your deal effectively. At a larger deal, it's usually a mergers and acquisitions professional, and a smaller deal, a business broker. And you can think of them as pushing the deal forward, right? They're going to push you to accept terms that you may not be totally comfortable with, because they get paid when the deal gets done, right? There's a commission at stake. And so they want to kind of nudge you gently towards a deal. The other side of the equation is the M&A lawyer, and their job is to pump the brakes, right? They're there to effectively ensure that you don't agree to something that you're going to end up regretting. And so, because they get paid not when things go well, but they are trying to protect you from the downside, and so they are likely to pump the brakes. They're not usually on a commission. There's no success fee when a deal gets done. And so, when those two forces kind of balance out, the M&A attorney slowing things down, the intermediary kind of pushing things forward, that's usually when a deal gets done. If either side has outsized weight or influence on the deal, that will end up either getting you in trouble, getting you accepting a deal you're not happy with, versus either one of the biggest common mistakes we see among hiring M&A attorneys is you hire the same attorney that you used to incorporate your business 20 years ago. And it's generally not the right person to sell your company, because M&A expertise, M&A law is different. It's a subset, it's a specialization. Just like your specialization in commercial real estate, that's a very, very deep subject matter expertise you have. The same way, your generic lawyer is not going to have the level of expertise you need to sell your company.
That's a great point. And kudos to anybody that specializes within a vertical part of any industry, because that takes a lot of time, energy, effort. And it is true that there's going to be, and you made the comment and I laughed, I actually wrote haha in the margin of the book when you said, if you're going to be getting hip surgery, you're probably not going to go to your family practitioner to have that. They're going to be referring you to an expert, someone that knows every little nuance about hips and does that surgery over and over and over again, because they're an expert and they're there to protect you. They're a subject matter expert. So I love that.
Before you go on, I'd love to just sort of put a little button on the end of that, because I think you're absolutely right. It's the tiny little detail. I'll give you another example. I'm going to keep the name of this entrepreneur out of this example because it's not a favorable example, but effectively he also was acquired by a private equity group. In the terms of the deal, the private equity group said that they were going to be taking on debt in order to finance the acquisition, which is very normal. However, in like the 38 page and 8-point font, the owner, and when he signed the share purchase agreement, was signing to personally guarantee the debt the private equity group company was going to take on to buy his business. Effectively, you can imagine selling a home and selling it only to co-sign the buyer's mortgage. I mean, it's insane. You'd never do that, right? Like when you want to sell your home, you want to remove yourself from the liability, not necessarily take it on. But that's the level of detail, like literally 8-point font on a 50-page share purchase agreement, and why you need an M&A attorney, not the guy or gal who incorporated your company. It just never ceases to amaze me, the kind of stuff that they try to put into these deals.
It's a great cautionary tale. And I can explain from experience without sharing too many details of this particular deal, but I'm working on a transaction today that reminds me of a transaction a couple of years ago. And a great attorney that I've worked with multiple times shared with me that when putting together the LOI for a commercial real estate transaction, and then reviewing the PSA, or the purchase and sale agreement, or contract, as many will call it in real estate, that what happens is a lot of times when you work with, and this was a pretty sophisticated group on both sides, when you work with a developer or a company that has an in-house general counsel, they'll sort of have a stock or boilerplate contract that they'll offer up as part of the negotiation once you've gone under LOI, but not formally under contract, or formally under contract. And the attorney said to me, representing the buyer and working on my side, is that they said, we almost always say, yeah, that's not the contract we want. We want the contract that has X, Y, and Z in it, and we know what we're doing. And so send us that contract. And they go, oh, okay. It's sort of a litmus test of how sophisticated you are, or did you fall off the turnip truck? And it's just, John, it's amazing to me that that sort of, posturing exists, but it does.
Yeah. And you mentioned litmus test. This is another example from a guy I interviewed for the podcast. And he did something very similar in order to sort of communicate his level of sophistication to the buyer. And it comes back to something you were talking about earlier, which is retrading. We should define that. I'm sure most of the listeners being steeped in real estate know what it is, but effectively you agree to a price with a buyer in a letter of intent, you sign that, and then there's a period of due diligence after which the buyer renegotiates. They lower their price, and they oftentimes manufacture reasons to do that. It's called retrading, and that happens all the time. So one of the people I interviewed on the podcast that I do, a guy named Barry Hinckley, was exposed to this in a very negative way. He had a software business that he sold only to have it retraded on the back end. And he said, I'm never again going to fall victim to the retrading shenanigans. And so and I said, so what do you do? And he said, well, I do the retrading handshake. And I said, what's the retrading handshake? And he said, you get all the terms, nailed, you get all the I's dotted, the T's crossed. And when you have the price and everything agreed to, you walk up away from the table, you go to the most senior person in the room for the buyer's side of the equation, and you look them straight in the eye, you put out your hand and you say, I will do this deal on one condition. What's that? That there is no retrading. And he said, it's amazing what that does, because it is basically telegraphing to the other side that you're a sophisticated buyer, similar to the way your lawyer was saying, no, we give us the other contract. It says to them, okay, this guy is for real. This person knows what they're doing, and we can't sort of use our typical tricks on them. So I've always remembered the no retrading handshake as a great little tool.
John, I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because I highlighted 7 points, and this is what I wanted to share with our audience, and you just segued into it, and it's so awesome. I love when podcasts just work that way, because this was point number 7 of several tips just with any type of negotiation, whether you're doing an M&A, business sale, or shares that are being sold and transferred, or if you're doing a real estate transaction, or you're buying a car, or whatever, So number 1 is nail your results. Don't give the buyer any excuses. So, once you've got a deal sewn up, and like I said, the parade is gone, make sure that you're keeping whatever it is operating the way that the buyer expected it prior to going under contract. Number 2, be transparent. Number 3, check their reputation. And that's a great suggestion on who the buyer is. And create competition. We've talked about that quite a bit. Limit due diligence, and you give a certain amount of days, but I think it's probably just important to say, let's limit due diligence and not give someone, a super long finish line here. Use an intermediary, a trusted advocate. Employ the no retrading handshake. So what great suggestions that you've given to us on just negotiating tips, and such a cool thing. And I can imagine, that is sort of the spirit of a deal. Obviously, someone can still renegotiate. They can still try to attempt to retrade, but you're at least setting the tone that I know what I'm doing. And I am expecting that you're thinking you're going to put this under contract and renegotiate with me. And I'm just saying, we're not going to deal with those shenanigans.
Yeah. And the key here, I think, is getting multiple offers. And so, that the process of selling a company involves a series of usually letters of intent where the terms of the deal are outlined. And really what you're looking for is multiple LOIs, which gives you the ability to have leverage and dictate the terms that are most important to you. Not only that, it also helps ensure that the buyer knows there are other willing buyers at the table. So if they were to retrade, that downstream you can walk away from the deal knowing that there are active buyers. And so that's an important prerequisite, I think, to going through this diligence period, is to ensure that the buyer knows there were other offers at the table which are easily rekindled.
Yeah, it's a great suggestion. And it's something, especially in commercial real estate, that happens often where you have a lot of people making offers, and offer number one tries to play some tricks. I'm in the middle of a deal like that, different than the one I talked about with the attorney, where that's actually going on right now, where we are on buyer number two, and buyer number two is better in a number of different examples, but we wasted a lot of time. It's now that we know that that transaction didn't work out, we can say we wasted time, but we were all working in good faith to make sure that we could go through the various inspections and analytics and all these different things. And buyer number one, it just didn't work out. And buyer number two, all of a sudden, the seller knew that we had actually 5 buyers to go back to. And that gave them the strength and feeling like they weren't, they didn't have their feet to the fire on what the buyer number one was asking. So great suggestions. I'd like to dive deep in the real estate business, because what happens, and my goal from starting a brokerage business, a boutique brokerage company back in 2016, is that at some day I may transfer that the shares that I own in the business with my wife. It could be to our kids. It could be to other important people within the business that we want to reward for their loyalty. It could be someone approaches us from the outside and says, we want to have a footprint in Denver, and we know that you're a market expert in a certain vertical that we want to be a part of. And so there's all these different things where a business owner is just sort of bootstrapping it, sweat equity, doing their thing. And then all of a sudden it grows and grows and grows. And I would imagine you've worked with a lot of people that you've communicated with where it's sort of, I would imagine that they don't even know that all of a sudden their business has gotten to this point where it's valuable, right? It's no longer just a business of one, or a business that's controlled by just that single person. And so in the real estate industry, some of the things that happen, John, and if you can go with me here, is that you'll have that situation where maybe an outside source will say, we want to have a footprint in this geographic area. You're the market expert. We want to buy part of your company, keep you on as a key man or a key woman. We want you to have a certain amount of time that you have to stay with the company, all these different things. Or what could happen as well is you're looking at retirement, and maybe you just operate a real estate brokerage team, and one of your maybe juniors or people that's a little bit younger than you may buy that book of business from you. What are some things that you would suggest for people in the real estate industry that may sort of just be trying to do the right thing for their clients for a number of years, and then all of a sudden they get to retirement age and they're like, I've got this brand, I've got this persona in the marketplace, and I've got a book of business that is probably going to play out for 4 or 5 years. And what are some things you'd suggest to them, of just things to consider as they're looking at maybe selling or transferring that business to someone else that's going to take it forward?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I think is a little bit of a shift in goal setting. So for a lot of us as entrepreneurs, when we think about goals, we think about, top line stuff, right? It's very easily to measure. So number of deals, volume of deals, revenue into the company, profits, take home pay, all those things that are very objective and measurable. And while I think those are amazing goals to have, I think there's another way to think about your role as an entrepreneur. And I think it's particularly important if your goal is to one day transition your real estate business away from you personally to a new buyer, for example. And that is actually to think of your company like a child. And I know you're a parent, I'm a parent, and I think, we all have sort of aspirations for our kids, but for most parents, we would be happy if our kids got out of the house, got a job, we're happy, functioning adults in the world, right? If our kids are, in my case, if my kids go on to play quarterback for Alabama, or start the next Microsoft, that's great, but it's not my expectation, right? Like, I would be super happy if they were just happy, functioning adults. If you take the same view of your role as you do to a parent to your company, and you say, look, I may be a great rainmaker, I may be a great deal guy or a great deal gal, but actually every deal I personally do is in some ways taking me a step further away from my goal of effectively transitioning this business. And so as hard as it is, I would start to demote the objective measurable goals of profit and number of deals and so forth, and start to think, if I really just wanted to raise this business into a functioning independent entity that could live without me, what would I do? What decisions would I make? I mean, it comes down to even the most basic things, like whose face is on the billboards, right? Whose name is in the company name? Like, you've done a great job of naming your company because it's not, Kyle's Real Estate, right? Like, so that's easier to start separating. If you find yourself in a business where you are the namesake of the business, like your brokerage is, like in my case, it would be like Warrillow Realty or whatever. What you've got to somehow do is transfer that relationship equity you enjoy with your clients and make it into company equity in terms of people being loyal to your company, not just you personally. So that's a maybe not as practical an answer as you were hoping for, Kyle, but it's a philosophical change for a lot of people, in particular those in real estate that are known for the deal and the transaction.
Well, I actually love your answer, because what I hear in it, and it's going to be such a shot across the bow of any realtor listening to this or any real estate professional listening to this, is that the biggest key, if you want to have a business that is sellable, is you've got to check your ego at the door. Because one of the things that happens for a lot of us is we're used to getting a lot of the accolades. Of course, we're doing it for our clients, but we present how many deals we did this year and what our top line sales were. And no one has any clue whether you're profitable or not when you talk about $68 million sold this year.
Number one in New Orleans, or
Right. What does
whatever.
that mean? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. What does it mean? And really, it comes down to creating a system and
Yeah.
being able to implement a repeatable process that others can go through it. This may or may not resonate, but one of my favorite thought leaders in any business space is a guy named Dave Ramsey. Dave Ramsey is a huge author, huge spokesperson on his show. And as I have actually been a part of their coaching program and some different things, Dave has made it really, really clear that he wants to focus on what he calls non-Dave revenue. And over the past, he's been doing this now 25 plus years. Over the past 5 or 10 years that I've noticed, he's been really focused on how can I bring others up through the Dave Ramsey brand, through similar thought processes, and basically create other spokespeople. And he specifically calls some of them Ramsey personalities, where they're kind of doing the same thing Dave used to do as a person of one, but they're carrying a torch in a certain vertical within their company that's really important to him. And he's no longer the only person that's a thought leader in that space. So I think it's a great example, a great reminder that you get to a point where you do enjoy doing deals and you do enjoy doing business. And in the real estate profession, we have this amazing ability to have very quick revenue hits. And it's almost like the slot machine, where it's like, all right, I want to do another one, but you do really need to start to step back from being the front line of production and bringing others up. And it's hard. It's really hard for us business owners to say, well, it started by just, one person, asserting their will in the marketplace. And now how do I bring others up in it? And it's kind of a crazy mind shift. So I do appreciate your answer.
Yeah, and I love the non-Dave revenue. I think that's a great hook.
Non-Kyle, non-John revenue.
Yeah, right? yeah. No, it's great. It's great. And I think a lot of, if we're honest with ourselves, a lot of the listeners of this show probably have an incredible expertise, great intuition, amazing with clients, understand the kind of math of the deal and so forth. And at the same time, they probably have a degree of unconscious competency, meaning they are really good, but don't necessarily know exactly what they do to be that good. And so what I would encourage, and so therefore it can be hard to codify your process. It can be hard to teach your process when you're unconsciously gifted. And so I think it's a challenge, because people will say, well, no one can do it as well as I can. And that's a very common sentiment. And so what I would encourage you to do, or anyone listening, is to hire an ISO 9000 consultant or a process engineering consultant You can get them on Upwork, or you can Google people who do this and say, I want you to systematize what I do. I want you to interview me in a series of one-on-one in-depth interviews to such a level of detail that you could teach someone else what I do. And that is a very specific skill set. Like someone who's an ISO 9000 consultant is a very specific skill set. They thrive in making chaos into process. And that's, I think, an investment really worth making if you are making the goal of transitioning from kind of being a rainmaker to building a company.
Very good advice. And I've never heard of that. So that's ISO 1000. Is that
No, ISO 9000. It's like a
9000?
manufacturing designation, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Or process engineers, anyone who focuses on helping you, make process effectively, which is, I mean, it's funny. That the whole idea of sort of personality traits, like most of us as entrepreneurs, that's just, we're allergic to process, right? So we like the shiny ball, what's new, what's exciting, what's interesting, client problem, I'm going to swoop in and solve it. Like that's all good. That's all good stuff for us, right? The last thing we want to do is sit there and like knock out the same process. And so it's one of those areas where you kind of need someone from the outside to come help you do it.
It's such a funny example. I'm glad you said the bright and shiny object. I have a buddy in college that used to sort of make fun when we were in a fraternity of some of the younger guys that would get distracted by whatever, and he'd say bright lights and fuzzy objects. It just takes them right off of their track.
Yeah,
Um,
that's
Before
awesome.
we kind of transition to the second half of or the later half of our interview, I've got to just ask you, John, about Built to Sell Radio. You interview, you do all these Q&A sessions with business owners, and you create actionable advice on selling their businesses. I've got to imagine that you have been, kneecap to kneecap, or even just over Zoom with someone that's very successful, that's sold their business and done very well. Any common traits that you found with some of these really successful business sales, and things that you've noticed from people that you could impart to our audience today, of just ways that they can be better business professionals?
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, that's what inspired me to write the book. To be honest, it was seeing that, I've done now 300 plus interviews with entrepreneurs who've sold their company, everything from $1 million or two up to one exit was for more than $1 billion. So I've done the gamut. Most business owners who exit at a typical industry average multiple. So if they're in an industry that trades at 1x revenue, they're going to trade around that. There's this sort of subgroup, though, small cohort of people who punch well above their weight. They're getting, 2, 3x the industry multiple for their company. And that's what I really wanted to sort of try to demystify, decode in this book, The Art of Selling Your Business. So that was the idea behind the book. And I guess there are a bunch of traits that I've seen. One is this notion that it is an art more than a science, meaning many of us think of the selling of a business as much like a real estate. There's a marketable, there's a market rate for that amount of square footage, and therefore that's what it should go for. And there's an entire industry that are out there, certified valuation consultants, that basically value businesses. And that's the science of it. But there is this sort of art form, which is that a lot of what selling well is about helping the new buyer imagine what that business would be in their hands. I'm reminded of a story in the book. It starts the book. It's a guy named Rob Ryman who sold a painting. Now, this painting is a white square on a white canvas. It's just the most ridiculous looking piece of art, and air quotes. It's literally looks like a high school cafeteria ceiling tile. I think there's a little bit of gravy on it's just a white square. Yet Ryman sold it at a Christie's auction for more than $20 million. And I see a ceiling tile, but someone who appreciates minimalist art sees an incredible piece of art. And I think that's one of the things that the best sellers have in common, is they realize that value is in the eyes of the acquirer, that it's not their job to put a price on the asset they are selling. It's in fact the buyer's job to, given all of the the knowledge they have and the experience they have and the assets they have to put a price on the business, because that's the kind of romance of it. That's again, the art as opposed to the science.
I love that story, especially about the painting. And it reminds me, John, and right before we get into some of our prescriptive questions that we have for all guests, it just reminds me of the idea that there are certain brands out there. And a lot of times people think of more mainstream type of brands, where I'm sure a lot of the businesses that you've been a part of in interviewing people that have sold business, people have never heard of. But there's a lot of brands out there that sort of have that it factor, that just are, for whatever reason, you can just tell that they like they said, they out punch their weight. I haven't heard that phrase before. That's great. And so what are some of the brands that you love personally after studying all these other businesses? But then what are some of the brands that you're just like, I just feel like I'm hooked by their vision, or I'm hooked by their company culture, or I just love to shop there because it's a brand that really resonates with you, John?
I love great products and great design. So I love Tesla because it's a great product with a great design. It's innovative. It's going to change the world. It is changing the world. I love Peloton. I'm an Apple fan. So that whole kind of cadre of brands where I think they're maybe design first and they are, product first. Those sorts of brands, I'm a huge sucker for. When I hear those three saying those words out loud, it's like, wow, could you be more cliche? Like three of the biggest, most sort of like, but they work for me because they emphasize, again, design and kind of product first.
Well, and I think they all do a great job. I mean, the design obviously on each one of those products is very clean, but they also do a great job of sort of challenging the establishment, right? You think about Peloton challenging your typical, athletic facility or gym. You think of Tesla, obviously trying to, in many ways, and people will have different thoughts about this. I live in Denver, where there's a lot of people in the oil and gas industry. So I try not to offend any of my buddies, but there's a lot of people that feel like, that's the wave of the future and helping the planet and different things. And so sort of challenging the establishment with Tesla. And then you think of Apple. I mean, Apple is all about thinking differently. And if you actually look at Apple's market share as it relates to a lot of the different product lines, it's actually kind of a small market share, but they have such great revenue in multiple market shares because their customers and their clients, they just are raving fans, and they just get it, and they'll wait in line for hours on a new launch of a new product that Apple has. And it's really cool. Very, very cool. And I agree with you on those three brands. Okay, we've got three questions that I ask all of my guests towards the end of our show. Before I do that, John, we're doing this really great promo, and thank you. A big kudos to Greenleaf Book Group. They have provided us with several, both advanced copies as well as published copies of your book, The Art of Selling Your Business. We're going to be giving these away. You can get the book by leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. That's our biggest area of focus. But if you drop an email to info@calibratere.com, that's another way of just saying, hey, I love a copy of the book. Here's where I shared it. If you share on Instagram, Facebook, etc. But we've got, about 10 books here that we're going to be giving away. And the other part too is that as much as you can get this book for free from us, please support authors. Go out and buy the book. John, where can people buy the book today?
Best place to go is builttosell.com. We put together a little starter kit for folks that, regardless of where you are in the journey of building to sell, whether you're just starting, whether you're accelerating the value or ready to actually start thinking about harvesting some of the value, there's a whole set of gifts that we've got for folks. So yeah, just builttosell.com, top right corner, it'll say, you can see the button free gifts, and you can get yourself a starter kit.
Awesome. All right, here we go. Final three questions. So our company and also the podcast is named Calibrate Real Estate. I love Calibrate because so many businesses are named after a noun, especially in real estate. So it's a thing. And I love action. I love making things happen. I love making intentional iterations and adjustments. One of my favorite definitions of Calibrate is to adjust, taking experimental results, sort of that trial and error approach, taking external factors into account and allowing appropriately some comparison with other data to get to a better result. So I like to ask all of our guests in the new year here, what are you doing on a daily basis, John, to calibrate your life and make your existing situation progress forward to a better situation?
I don't know if it's progress forward. I think it's hopefully cling to the edges of the side of the wall. I'm getting fat and old, Kyle, and so every morning I do a Peloton stack. So I do 30 minutes of riding, a 20-minute Peloton like strength workout, which you would probably look at it and go, "That's pathetic," but it works for me. And a 10 minutes of stretch. And again, I'm calibrating not to move forward, but to cling to whatever modicum of fitness I have left to hold on to it as long as I possibly can. So I use a Peloton stack.
All right, you're a Peloton guy, and my wife and I got a Peloton last year. Something that we're definitely not early adopters on, but we love it. The follow-up question I have before we get to our next one is, what's your post-ride ritual? Do you do anything in particular? Do you have a certain go-to that you do after a ride that gets you refueled?
No, like we have a team meeting, a team huddle at my company Value Builder, and it's at 9:02 to emphasize the precision of being on time. And so I usually run sweaty to put my AirPods on and have my call with my team at 9:02. So no fancy ritual, just
There you
just
go.
to work.
running right from it. And I think that's important. Getting your fitness in. A lot of us entrepreneurs, business owners, we're doing so much, and oftentimes we forget to help ourselves, right? And make sure that we've got good fitness as a keystone, or as a cornerstone of making sure that we can have the energy throughout the day to help others. And so I think that's great that your post workout ritual is actually helped by the Peloton itself, because you're coming in, you're coming into that at 9:02, and you've gotten your workout done, and you know you don't need to do that. It's the old concept of eat the frog, right?
I've never heard that expression. You've never heard
Oh,
punch above your weight, and I've never heard
so Eat the Frog is actually a book. It's a book title, but yeah,
Oh,
good.
okay.
I'm glad we exchanged some
Euphemisms.
colloquialism. Yeah. I love it. All right. Next question is one of my favorites, and it's one of my long lasting questions that I've asked literally probably 300 people now over different podcasts, is the advice you wish you knew when you were 22. It actually comes from a song that I really like called Dear Younger Me. And the person that wrote this song is writing a letter to themselves now that they've lived some life, had some failures, had some successes. And it's the wisdom you would impart to yourself if you could go back with the knowledge you have today and impart it to the younger John. Or if you've got a teammate working in your organization that's in their early 20s and comes up to you as a leader and says, "John, what should I do? What should I do to set myself up right in my 20s?" What's the advice you wish you knew when you were 22?
Gosh, this is such a great question. And I've got a young, like, kids, and so and they're not that far off that age, so it's helping me kind of remember. I'll tell you a funny story. When I was a kid, in university and college, and shortly after, I was so desperate to succeed. I was so ambitious, and so I thought, because college wasn't really my thing, I left early and started to train for an Ironman. And you and I shared triathlon in common, so I trained for a year and raced Ironman Canada, which at the time was in a place called Penticton, British Columbia. Long story short, achieved what I was hoping to achieve. I mean, it was like going to the top of the mountain, and I thought, this is incredible. I'm 22, I'm single, I'm, whatever. And so I took a bus trip, you can believe it, down to Santa Cruz, California. And, I was hanging out with folks there, and just sort of coming off this amazing achievement. At least in my mind, it was an amazing achievement. And I remember I had a flight home to Toronto, and I started to get a little bit antsy when I'm in Santa Cruz, and feeling a little bit like unmoored and not really focused, and, not on to the next thing. And I actually went home early. And I've always regretted that, because I thought, oh my gosh, you had the tail between, whatever, the tie between the tails. You had everything. You had independence. You could have done anything you wanted, yet you chose to get back on a plane, to go back to Toronto, to get back on the hamster wheel of the treadmill of life. And I think, gosh, if I could do that one over, I would do it over again, because I think, for people who are ambitious, and everybody listening to your show is, like, they're going to be successful. They're going to make enough money to do what they aspire to do. And the thing you can't recreate is that sense of independence and freedom, and and wonderment that you get when you're 22. And so if I could have slowed down just for a day and enjoyed that, I think I would have done that over again.
It is amazing that once you have obligations, once you have created some things, you've got a business, you've got, a spouse and kids and all these other things, all of a sudden, when you look back at just how free your life is and of obligation and other things, it is really a very finite window of time. There's of course people that sort of stretch that out longer, don't get married, don't have kids, don't whatever for a period of time. But for a lot of achievers and people that are opportunistic, that's great advice. I've actually never heard that in all the couple hundred times I've asked that question. Never heard that particular advice, and such a cool story too. I've never done an Ironman, a lot of sprint triathlons, but never an
Okay.
Ironman. So that's still on. I don't know if I actually even want to do that, but you do a sprint triathlon, you all of a sudden realize, okay, this is a real difficult thing. All right. Final question actually comes from an answer from a former guest of ours. On episode 5, I interviewed my career coach. So we're now, 160 plus episodes, and Chris's answer was that when he was in his 20s, he was actually part of a mastermind group or just kind of a young 20s group where the facilitator of the group said, guys, read this book. It's called The Principle of the Path by Andy Stanley. And in the book, they were instructed by Andy Stanley, the author, to write their own obituary. Sort of this start with the end in mind, which is a Stephen Coveyism from 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And so Chris wrote his obituary in his 20s and lived on mission for at least the next decade, knowing that was his mission. And after we recorded that episode, he tragically passed away in an accident. And so as a tribute to Chris, I ask this question now of what do you want your legacy to be? What would you hope? And an obituary seems more like a newspaper article that someone that doesn't know you writes, right? But if you were to have someone that had to recap your life in a eulogy, a trusted friend that would deliver your eulogy, or a family member, what would you want your legacy to be? What would you want to be remembered by, John?
What a great question, and kudos for you for keeping this alive in your own way. That's an incredible gesture to your former friend or your friend, and that's amazing. I think, obviously I'd want like great dad, great husband, right? Like those are the big things for me. But I'm assuming that's not exactly the answer you're hoping for. I think if I could have something professional on my tombstone, it would be he helped level the playing field for business owners. I think, everything that I've done in my career, the book Built to Sell and now the new one, I I am unabashedly in the corner of the entrepreneur. I think entrepreneurs are the fuel of our society. I think they are the ones that are going to solve the big challenges that we face as a world, and I think that they deserve a fair shake when it comes to selling their company. And right now, unfortunately, that doesn't always happen. Many of the buyers of small businesses today are private equity groups or strategic buyers, and their goal is to sort of buy your business for kind of pennies on the dollar and preying on your naivete and your ignorance on the process. And I think that's just a real tragedy. And so if I could have something on the tombstone, it might be something like, he leveled the playing field for a few business owners.
I love that answer. And I very much feel that way in commercial real estate for a lot of my local operators, my mom and pop operators that have been doing this for decades prior to meeting me. When I have the opportunity to sell something that's really, and you may not know this, but our intro actually talks about the mission of Calibrate Real Estate, which is we exist to help people create generational wealth through real estate. And we're very intentional about it. Chris Oakley actually helped us with that mission. And the intention there is that we don't work for big syndications. We work for a mom and pop. We work for someone who is literally investing for maybe their kids and their children's children and so on. And such a great reminder that helping the business owner, the entrepreneur that helps fuel the economy and making sure that they exit correctly, do it well and finish well is important, because they took so much risk and so much sacrifice to start out. And there's so many statistics about businesses that don't work out, and coming out of this pandemic, obviously it's just a tragedy to see all of the small businesses that are really struggling and may not make it. So I love your mission. I love that idea, and what you want to be known for. And absolutely, you want to be known for being a great dad, being a great husband, et cetera, et cetera. But I do appreciate that answer, John. Well, John Warrillow, thank you so much for your time. It's amazing how quickly these episodes go. Obviously, pick up John's books, any of them, Built to Sell, Automatic Customer, and the newest one, the one he's promoting right now, The Art of Selling Your Business. Thank you, John, for being a part of our show. Thank you to Greenleaf for setting this up. We've had some discussions privately I have with them, but I just think authors are amazing, and you have become an authority on a subject and are sharing subject matter that's just amazing, John. So thank you for doing that. I appreciate our podcast producer, Ann Russell, for setting this up. And I'm Kyle Malnati, your host, signing off. And as I love to say, we will see you around the neighborhood. Thanks, everybody.